So one night, this guy, his name's Thomas, and Thomas is chilling at home with his dad. And Dad, he decides to take the dog out for a walk and go get their mail. Like, I'll be back soon, son. A few minutes later, Thomas notices the dog is back in the house, but Dad isn't with him. So Thomas is like, that's weird. Wonder where he went. Then a day passes, and Dad still hasn't come back home. And Thomas hasn't heard from him, so he gets worried. And he calls the police, and he lets them know his dad is missing. And then officers drive over to Thomas's house, and they talk to him about it a little bit, and they start getting suspicious of Thomas. So they bring him in and they question him, and while he's there being questioned, police go and they search his house. And there, in his house, police find a potential blood stain on the stairs. Plus, the police dog signals that there could be human remains somewhere in the house. Meanwhile, back at the station, they tell Thomas about the evidence they just found at his house. And they start pushing him to confess and just admit that he unalived his dad. And Thomas is like, but I didn't unalive anyone. But police, they don't believe him, and they continue interrogating him all night long. Here's the thing about Thomas, though. He's got some mental stuff going on, and he normally takes medication for anxiety and depression. But because he's been with police for a while now, he hasn't been able to take it. So he begs them to give him some of his medication, but they don't. They just ignore his requests. Then one officer starts suggesting that maybe it was the medication that caused Thomas to snap and unalive his dad. And they keep pushing him to just show them where the body is. And at one point, they even put him in a patrol car, and they drive him around trying to get him to show them where the dad's body is. And this whole time, while they're driving him around, Thomas keeps telling them he didn't unalive anyone, and he's pleading with them to take him to the hospital because he feels sick and he needs his meds. But still, police just ignore his pleas and they take him back to the station. And poor Thomas, he's confused and his medication withdrawal is hitting, and he's starting to have a very obvious mental breakdown. But even still, officers just don't believe him. And that is when they decide to bring his dog in. And they're like, look at your dog. Don't you see how traumatized she is because she watched you unalive your own dad? And they tell him that the dog is so mentally messed up from what he did that they're going to have to euthanize her. And this makes Thomas feel even worse. But still, he maintains that he had nothing to do with his dad's disappearance. And after 17 hours of interrogation, police just can't get a confession out of him. But they don't give up. They decide to change tactics and lie. And they tell Thomas they've just found his dad's body and that it's all covered in stab wounds. And they tell him he just doesn't remember unaliving his dad because the medication he takes made him forget that he did it. And at this point, Thomas is so mentally worn down and he's just exhausted. And finally, he looks at them and he says yes. And he admits to unaliving his dad. And officers, they're like, sweet, because they just got their guy. And so they leave the room. They're done. But Thomas is